at several administrative regions of Russia, which are first underlined by permafrost and considered by Russian government as far north or Arctic, we will see that predominantly population lives, and approximately that's 1.8 million, out of 1.8 million, 1.3 living in urban communities. Right, so again, on that, oh, it's probably better here, high resolution. I just noticed that I have 3 screens. And I can use pointer on that one. Right, so basically each of those red dots represent an urban community. So and probably worthwhile to define what do we mean by urban. And obviously those are cities, but cities in Russia have a pretty strict definition. In Soviet Union it used to be 10,000 people living there, and 85% of residents are doing something other than agriculture. That's what constitute a city. Obviously, there are deviations in terms of population and histories of places and stuff like that. But as we can see, majority of those places have population significantly less than 10,000 people. So technically, they are not cities. But what we call them in Russia, those are urban communities, right? So they don't have that specific designation of cities, but rather urban communities. And if we count those, again, approximately more than 60% of permafrost regions, people live in those urban communities. And as an example, I want to show you 2 of those urban communities, which are not cities per se, but they do look like cities, right? So one is Tixi and another one is Chersky. Population Tixi, very similar to Barrow, 4,000 people in a change. Chersky is twice smaller than Barrow. But when you look at those pictures, you definitely see the difference between the North American permafrost settlements and Russian permafrost settlements, right? So, and by the way, I chose Tixi and Chersky simply because lots of you guys here are intimately familiar with those places, right? So, and the first question is why they're so different. Well, and one obvious answer is that Russians do live a little bit longer in permafrost regions and probably in any other Arctic countries. Again, this is a map we've done kind of a long time ago, which shows you very simple overlaying the permafrost boundaries and the dates of kind of a settlement. Some of them are still present and prospering. Some of them are not with us anymore. But at least you can see that people were living in permafrost areas and establishing settlements, well, for quite a few centuries now, right? But despite all that experience, if you travel to those communities, let's say at kind of in mid-1950s, you will see them like that. I mean, this is Igarka, Salihard, another Dudinka, again, just randomly sort of a selected places, and that's their 1959 census population. And we can see, for example, Igarka, 1959 on Yenisei, 14,000 people, right? So it's already can be considered to be a city. I mean, same with Dudinka, but if you look at those pictures, they kind of look similar to what we have in, in North America, right? So pretty much low-rise structures, sort of a little bit of sprawl, more individual housing, kind of, stuff like that, predominantly wooden architecture. And obviously, I mean, that's where we were by the 1960s in Russia. Obviously, with one major exception, and that's been the city of Norilsk, which was already in 1940s was planned as a sort of a grandiose socialist, city in the, in the Arctic, in the tundra. So those are initial plans for the city of Norilsk done in 1940. Obviously, not everything was realized, due to World War II, but the construction proceeded after the World War II, and we can see how those big buildings are coming up at 70 degrees north, essentially. Right, so and here it is, and that's kind of how it looks right now. So Norilsk's been a little bit of an exception because it started to develop as a major urban center a little bit earlier than other sort of a smaller towns on permafrost. And again, I mean, obviously there is a Yakutsk, and I know there are lots of people from Yakutsk, so we don't need to forget that. All right, but see, again, if we kind of go to Norilsk in, let's say, 1955, we can see like there is, few blocks, being developed, but on the fringes of a town, if you wander in outside those few blocks where we have those, beautiful infrastructure, we still have that sort of a very typical low-rise, housing. And the reason for that was that's where we come to permafrost. It's probably related to permafrost, right? So majority of that ground infrastructure was built on a very solid, even though it's continuous permafrost, on a very solid bedrock foundation, right? So there was a very thin sediment layer on top of the bedrock in those particular areas. So it was, again, it's laborious, but at least it was possible to excavate, remove or drive the piles and columns and place them on the solid footings. Once all that land got exhausted, I mean, then you go into something kind of a lower, because that's where you're having an ice-rich sediments. And then things have changed. In the terms of 1960, things have changed drastically. And there are many reasons for that. One of them ideological, economic, but in terms of infrastructure, they are probably related to that very famous quote of Nikita Khrushchev, right? So our leader after the Stalin, who proclaimed that we really need to increase the construction of housing, but at the cost of architectural design, right? So what's happened as a result? Proliferation of those prefab structures all over the Russia, right? So again, we can see that they are almost constructed like Legos. And there is the first neighborhood, Cheremushki in Moscow, where that type of development was tested in 1956, and then Soviets never looked back. I mean, that type of construction were proliferating, I mean, throughout Russia, right? So it was cheap, it was efficient, but what about permafrost? Well, more than 200 plants all over the Russia were constructed for those prefab structures. Well, sorry, just occurred to me, just looking at that thing, that in many ways it's similar to very famous Levitt and Son developers in the United States, who are approximately at the same time, maybe a few years earlier, came up with Levittown's, right? So all those very cheap prefab single-family housing, which also changed America, right? So for good or bad, I don't know, but that's kind of resulted in suburban sprawl all over the place. In Soviet times, obviously, there was more kind of a communal living. It's the same type of idea, but only on a grander scale. But what about permafrost? Well, I mean, proliferation of that type of structures into permafrost areas was done due to kind of a pioneering work of this distinguished gentleman, Michael Kim. Well, right, so he was a Gulag prisoner initially in Norilsk, and he was a civil engineer, and he came up with that design of piles on which, I mean, concrete, prefab concrete piles on which you can place those standard, like series 447, that's a brick, and there was another series 1464, as far as I remember, of those kind of a Khrushchev, prefab buildings. And what it did, I mean, that's a direct quote from the only English language paper I found by Kim. And it claimed, that you can read it here, that it's made construction significantly cheaper, significantly faster. And this is one of the first buildings in Norilsk, which was built on ice-rich, unconsolidated sort of sediments using that piling foundation. Boy, and once that technology was developed, they started to build those things like crazy. All right, so those are the same towns, right? So Igarka, but in 1970. Another Chersky, it was not there in, in 1930s and 50s, and Igarka. And we can see how in just a few, sort of maybe in a decade, the whole character of, of towns have changed. Right, so we can see and a lot of those buildings just popping up. Boy, and they were building them fast, right? So those are photographs from Norilsk from different ages, and this is official government sort of a inventory of housing in Norilsk, so when things were built. And we can see 1950 to 1951, 52 buildings. Well, they were massive, they were beautiful, but there were too few of them. And then if we look kind of a decade of 60s, 70s, 80s, right? So there was an increasing trend. So a lot of buildings were, constructing. And again, they were constructing them fast. How fast? Extremely fast. So this is example of Bigichova Street in Norilsk, where 39 buildings were constructed, pretty much the entire part of the city built in just 1.5 years. And this is an absolute record for permafrost areas or not for the Soviet Union. So that particular building was constructed in 15 days. Right, so imagine just driving piles, then putting all those, well, I mean, in Levittown, it probably took them longer to build those single-family residences than this. Obviously, you can guess that the quality of construction was probably, and in geoarchaeological investigations and everything which underlined that type of development was probably compromised, I would say. All right, so and that's, but some of those structures are still with us. Again, if we go to Norilsk, in downtown Norilsk, we can see those sort of a Cheremishki-like structures all over from 1960s, late 50s, 60s, 1970s, and then obviously the designs have changed as the time progressed, so those are more like late 70s and 80s. And then obviously everything has ceased due to the general malaise in 1990s, right? So not much constructions were done after that. And actually the people thought that this is such a big success of construction on permafrost that they proclaimed, this is Norilsk 1968, that permafrost is conquered. That's a mural on that building. Well, in 1968, that was permafrost is conquered. In 1979, that's the same street, right? So, a few buildings, appeared, but the mural have changed. Now, just kind of they decided to be a little bit more quiet about permafrost, conquering permafrost. And that mural is probably hard to see, but it's wisely advise you to unplug electrical appliances before leaving home, right? So that's just the same building. So, and there were probably reason for that, because permafrost was not conquered, right? So, and it started to, in 1970, it started to claim the territory back. Well, this is a map, and actually we do have a poster. It's blurry intentionally, so you will all drift to that particular poster by Valery and colleagues, us, me and Dima included, which shows you the thermal field, the change in permafrost temperature in Norilsk from 1940s to mid-1980s. Right, so, and we can see here, again, there are some statistics, sorry, it's probably hard to see there, but what Valery had found that, well, approximately 20% of structures sort of were decrease the permafrost temperature, right? So that was relatively stable. 10% no change, but staggering 70% of structures undergone significant warming underneath, and to the extent of undermining the structural bearing capacity, and as a result, structural stability of buildings. And surprisingly, the first street which started to go was appropriately named Laureate Street, which was constructed in mid-1970s and named after Kim and his colleagues who got a very prestigious, well, the most prestigious Lenin Prize for their technology, right? So, and in the street, this is a modern Google image, we can see all those voids. So basically, on the right hand of the street, right side of the street, every single building except one had to be demolished, right? So after just a few years of construction. Right, so, and the reason for that, again, so those are, old photographs, and that's like photographs taken in 2012 of the same street, and we can see that those buildings are not with us. And it's, again, it's not 2000, they were demolishing them through late 70s to 1980s. And the reason for that is probably this. Right, so again, this is Valeri's work, Laureatov Street, 67, borehole, and we can see the decrease of temperature. We do have pre-construction records, but from 85 to 2014, that sort of a temperature have increased quite dramatically. Well, is it climate change? Well, probably not. It's just lack of that proper planning and proper development. For example, this is the low-lying areas. So those are fringes of town, low-lying areas. So, and there was no sufficient storm drainage provided. So basically, all the city drained into that poor street, kind of water collected, and we all know that it might kind of undermine the permafrost underneath. Well, it's not just Laureatov Street. So now if you go all over the city, over Norilsk in downtown, you can see things like that, right? So that's basically, you can see the remnants of the foundations, you can see piles, but nothing on top of them. Why? Because buildings were probably deformed significantly and had to be removed. Well, this is an official map of housing in Norilsk produced by the mayor's office of Norilsk by 2010, and everywhere where we can see those red squares around structures, that's the structures which have significant deformation of them. So if you look at the official government statistics, it looks like that, and that's just occupied buildings, not including buildings which were already demolished. So we have quite a significant, almost 20% of all structures now in Norilsk have some sort of a deformation. And quite a few of them have significant deformation, and those are occupied buildings. And it came to this situation where it's kind of interesting. This is a population curve for the Norilsk, right? So we started roughly with 300,000 people. Now we dropped to 170, but there is an acute shortage of housing in the city. So that's kind of a really interesting, again, by permafrost climbing it back. This is other examples, obviously, in Igarka, but what is the reason of those deformation? Is it climate change? Well, I don't know. But initially, all these things started to go even earlier. This is 1985 pictures. For example, they were constructing that massive structure in the 80s, undermined the ground thermal regime, so that building cracked, right? So obviously, due to the lack of maintenance, in the 1990s, leaks in utility lines underneath, kind of in that crawl space between the ground and the elevated buildings, that obviously contributed to a lot of deformations. And finally, socioeconomic conditions, right? So if you go to Russia in 1990s, for example, you would see lots of those things, those little kiosks popping up. Obviously, they were, that's a cheap structure. You can put it anywhere, sell your liquor and cigarettes, and, very efficient. But obviously, they were not conducting any geological investigation, put it on ice-rich permafrost, right? So that sort of a thermokarst will develop very fast, and that will not just undermine that little guy, but can spread into the structures nearby. But what about climate change? Right, so after all, we do have temperature changing. And this is a record for Norilsk, and that's general for the area, and SEPRI analysis. And in sort of mid-2000s, sort of the media reports like that started to pop up, right? So, all right, so that building cracked, another building cracked, right? So, and let's blame everything on climate, even though probably majority of it were attributed to this. Well, and that's what we kind of tried to investigate, constructed a simple model just to see what is a climatic contribution to that decrease in bearing capacity. And we see that, yeah, it's probably working a little bit. So this is our map, but this is published work. I mean, I can give you reference. I'm not going to talk too much about it because, yeah, Guido is extremely strict. But again, and there is some a little bit of forecasting we've done, just looking what will happen to those foundations as the climate change will progress based on ensemble of different GCM models. And the one take home message here is that it varies drastically depending on what kind of a model you are using, right? So, I mean, and the estimates are varying from everything stable till 2050 to like everything will collapse within the next 10 years, right? So, and that's probably relates to our policy discussion we had yesterday. So how do you relate that information to city planners and engineers, especially considering that those communities are struggling financially, right? So money is an issue, right? So which one, how do you mitigate, adapt to the change? So that's kind of one of my close to final slides. So are there any hope, right? So that's Nadezhda means hopes in Russian, for the infrastructure like that. Well, there is a hope. And one we've seen in Norilsk over the last couple years, when they really invested in redevelopment of cities and using those abandoned foundations in the core of in the core of downtown to put something lighter. So essentially, they were demolishing buildings, leaving them for a year or two, right? So letting them to refreeze and then sell them to investors to put much lighter, more like a North American structure on those foundations. After all, foundations, it's most expensive part of the building in permafrost regions. And now we see kind of things like that starting to pop up over the place. And the first time in 20 years, the residential building was constructed in Norilsk. Kind of looks similar, but completely different technology. It's just all those frame type structures, and actually they've been using Canadian technology. And there are plans still to kind of continue to use it to revitalize the infrastructure within Norilsk and in other towns. There are some renderings of that. And this is my conclusion. And again, being a product of Soviet education, I do need to quote our leaders, right? So, and for once, I do agree with the Russian government. This is a quote by Dmitry Rogozin quite recently. He is a vice prime minister and chair of the State Committee on Arctic Development, who I do agree with that. So what do we need to do? It says right there, will Russian government invest in enough resources and into this? That's yet to be seen, but at least they do recognize it as a major problem and hopefully will address it. And finally, we do need to acknowledge our funding sources. All right, so